we want to welcome all our listeners to our post-worship conversation of Wrestling with Doubt and Finding Faith series. We pray that this podcast will be an opportunity for us to come together and share our thoughts about each subject. And today we're talking about why do innocent people suffer? This will also be an opportunity for you to hear the preachers who we have here, Ellen, Jonathan, and she's laughing because
my name's
and
Josh.
Joshua and RJ here on what they couldn't have shared and what they struggled with. So I'm glad we're all gathered here today again. And I wanted to talk about why do innocent people suffer? If innocent people suffer, and all the people who are coming to church on a very faithful way, why in the world should we still believe? That's the question that's in front of us.
Yeah, that's like asking why do bad things happen to good people?
Right?
Yeah.
Which, for our viewers, if you want to Google, that's the study of theodicy.
Yeah, there you go.
But I think as we get started on thinking about suffering and thinking about how we've dealt with suffering as a Christian faith or as the church, I think it's a question that we continue to wrestle with and struggle with all throughout Scripture. There's struggling all throughout. I'm even reminded, some of you all may have used the example of Jacob wrestling with the angel and was then given the name Israel, which means suffering. And so, correct me if I'm wrong.
Power of name. I'm just talking about power of name.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I'm like, correct me if I'm wrong here, but if my memory serves me well, it's people who suffer, people who struggle. And so I think that's a huge part about our identity of who we are. We're not immune to it.
This was a little bit of a side note. I was just going to jump in on that story that, Jacob's wrestling with God. Fascinatingly, I think that, in that story, Jacob walks away changed. He has a physical mark that is left from that wrestling with God. And so I think that's a fascinating piece as we're talking about, this experience of suffering and, being able to come to it with the recognition that it does shape us. It does change us. It does, that's marked by the change in name, but we also have this physical reminder in the story that they walk away a different person.
And probably that might be the reason why Jesus said, rejoice when you're persecuted.
Yeah.
So I wanted to just jump into and kind of pull us to one of the things that came from the book about the concept of everything happening for a reason.
Yeah, that's everything happening for a reason. That's just isn't right.
That's good. Okay.
And what I mean by that is I think of like if you're like at a funeral and you try to tell someone that, it's just. We live in a world where there's a lot of brokenness. There's things that are beyond people's controls. People act foolishly. People make very terrible decisions. Like I think of, there was at one of my churches, Rectortown, there was wonderful church people that were going off with some young kids to get ice cream. And as they were coming back home, someone decided to drive drunk and actually hit the vehicle, and they died. And that event happened decades ago, but my church still talks about it. And we as a people do foolish things. We do things that are incorrect and wrong, and there are repercussions from it. And so just to say something like that, like at a funeral for those that were affected by this tragedy that happened at my church, it's not right, and it's not helpful to those families who just need sometimes it's better to say nothing, or to say, I'm just sorry and I'm here with you. And I'm here with you in the midst of your suffering, and just to be with them, and rather than trying to make sense of something.
I think the other issue with that statement is it's a theological statement. Because it says that everything happens for a reason. It says that God is in control of everything, and because God is in control of everything, God wills for those bad things to happen.
Right.
I think that for me is the
And
bottom.
then you go to that family and say it was God's will for.
Correct. I think that's the bottom line issue for me with that
Yeah.
statement is
Yeah.
that when something bad happens, a house fire or even something we intend to do like war, God intended for those innocent victims to die. No, God did not intend for those innocent victims to die. I don't think that's in God's will. And so that statement of everything happens for a reason is a theological statement in saying that God wills all things to happen, whether good or bad or evil or not. And if God wills evil things, then we've got an issue.
Oh yeah, I think it's something that's often spoken out of a place of I don't know what else to say, and
Yes.
I really want to
Yes.
offer something comforting in this time that'll help you feel better. But the thing is, you gotta also think about being on the receiving end of that. And if you're someone who is experiencing unimaginable tragedy or loss or suffering or trauma, and someone says that to you, oh my gosh, how hurtful is that that's who God would be to me personally, that God would will this in my life. And so when we say, I've always really struggled with folks that have said, oh, well, everything happens for a reason. And I know some people really believe that and they've taken comfort in that. To me, it has always been deeply troubling. But what I choose to look at instead is I can say, okay, well, I don't think everything happens for a reason. I do think that our God is a creator. And so I think God has the ability to create reason out of things that happen, meaning that God can take some of these horrible things that have happened in our lives and redeem them. Resurrect them. Yeah, there you go. That's the business that our God is in. But, because that's the business of God, that is not the same thing as saying that horrible thing was the will of God to happen.
I agree with you that people say it because they don't know what else to say. But if we just if we're going to give a practical suggestion of what to do, I would just go back to Romans. I don't know the verse and chapter where it says, rejoice with the ones who rejoice and weep with the ones who weep. All we need to do is weep with them instead of trying to rationalize it. And there's that part of God's will. And there's another part where, Josh, you said, there's some people who weaponize God's will.
Yeah.
Right? So this whole God's will talk, I actually realized that there's so much baggage. It's so hard to talk about God's will happening in our lives. Because once I say there should be God's will where we follow, and then everything that happened bad, and the question of, so did God do this on purpose? Kind of comes into mind, which makes us struggle even more.
And Ellen, I think you hit it perfectly right. It comes from a good place when people say it. I don't think they intend ill will from it when they say those words to somebody who's grieving or hurting, or I think they intend to comfort. But I think we also have to be going back to last podcast. What we speak has power.
Yeah.
And so sometimes we need to think about what we speak or what we say, and how we say it, especially to people that are hurting or grieving, because we want to be a people that not breaks down but renews, that lifts up, that resurrects. That's the story that we want people to know about the God we serve.
So as using that as a kind of segue, I'm going to go about different causes of suffering. I am going to share a context of where we are at this moment. We're in a place where we have war around in this world.
Yeah.
And we have innocent lives who are suffering because of that war. And go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, I think actually looking at the global things help us to think through all kinds of different types of suffering and that how it's caused. Wars is caused by other humans being able to be at war with one another, killing one another.
And it actually uses God's name to justify their action as well.
Right.
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
And but we also have suffering caused by natural disaster that, ironically, we call acts of God.
Because God is in control of everything, right?
Right. So we also, and people are illness causes suffering, which is many of us are still coming through COVID-19 and trying to figure that out. And did God will that? And sometimes we just plain out have accidents. So as we talk about this, I think that those are probably 4 helpful, big scale macro understandings of how suffering happens. And so yeah, let's talk about that. Suffering happens by humans causing suffering. I think that's where we could start.
I think the reason why we go to God being the reason of all our suffering may come because we just can't comprehend what's happening. And for us to, I'm not saying we're blaming God, but it's just for us, we can't understand it. We kind of point to God. And the 4 parameters that we're sharing, I hope that it just kind of gives us a way to point it back onto where the real cause may be, instead of blaming God and therefore using it as a reference of us walking away from God. So going back onto what Joshua had said, suffering by human causes.
I think when we talk about suffering caused by human activity, I think we have to say either we have free will or not. If we have free will, then we have human suffering caused by humans.
Because we
have free will, because we have dominion. We have that ability to make that choice of causing suffering or not. I have the choice of whether or not I hit RJ or not. Right? Sorry, RJ, I'm not going to hit you. But we have that choice. Try it.
Great suffering.
Oh, mercy.
Yeah.
And so that act of suffering caused by another human being isn't God's will. It's not that God said, Josh, go and hurt somebody. It's I made a choice, and it may be in my own sinfulness, in my act against God's will, that I caused harm, or that somebody causes harm to another human being.
And I also would add on, free will also means that God will not intervene and say, don't hit RJ, unless we're willing to follow God's will. I think that needs to be clarified as well.
And I mean, I also know that there's been a ton of studies around this, that the abused become the abusers. That recognizing that those who are causing harm are doing so because they themselves have experienced
Victims.
harms themselves. And so when we have those tragedies of shooters going into schools, or shooters going into malls, or shooters, most of the times I don't think that they're just mentally deranged. I think that they themselves have experienced harm from others. And so and that's not to write off that what they did was right. No, they didn't. What they did wasn't right at all. But to recognize that they didn't just wake up one day and say, I think I'm going to go and do this. No, they experienced something that brought them to that decision. And most of the time.
This is a very compound issue in terms of what humans might have done wrong to kind of come into a fact of a form of a suffering. A lot of the times where I hear suffering, and the one that hits us the most closest is actually some of the medical emergencies that we experience. And cancer is something that we hear a lot. It's a word that we have confidence to beat it, but it's also still a very scary word. And a lot of the times people would say, "Why? I don't know why God had gave cancer to me." And one thing that I appreciate from the book is that I don't think, and Adam Hamilton was saying, and I'm paraphrasing him, I don't think God is a God who will give cancer to us.
Yeah.
And how can we kind of then how are we to understand it is the question. Where did it come from?
I think some of this also, goes back to these, talking about these causes of suffering. Some of it, like Josh was talking about, like you described it really well. Some of it is, it's the act that it is one distinct action that happens. Josh punches RJ, right? Like that's
I'm so glad that that's the example we're going to use.
We're going to run with here. No, it's the presence of free will where there is a decision that is made and harm is done. But there are also things that happen in the world that are sources of suffering that aren't a result necessarily of one person's decision or even a collective group of people's decisions. We can talk about systemic sin within the I'm thinking about apartheid South Africa and the way that even down to the infrastructure was built in a way to promote racism, and we can name that as sin, to say that we're going to use the roads or the power grid to keep one group of people, in a place of oppression. We can name that as the presence of sin. And that may have been one person's decision. It might have been a collective decision. But there are these powers and principalities at work that create systemic sin. They create suffering, and that also brings us to this idea of natural disasters causing suffering. That is not one person making a choice to cause suffering. That there was no decision that caused that hurricane or that flood or that tornado. It just is.
In the world that we're living in.
Yeah.
And I think that, not that we
do live in a fallen and broken world as a result of the sin of humanity. So, and not everything, we don't understand, like, why there's earthquakes, but I think we can recognize that the world is broken, and that what it makes me think of is Romans 8, where Paul is talking about how the earth groans, how creation groans for the fulfillment and being renewed by God, and I think that's a humble reminder for me of how the world needs restoration too.
Well, and also recognizing that the world itself has natural processes. I'm reminded of, as I said, part of my background is firefighting. Some of the reasons why we are having huge wildland fires over in California is not because we are horrible at containing fire. It's because we've actually been so good at keeping fire from getting into those woods that those woods have overgrown, and we've turn what would have been a small wildland fire into a mega fire. And so, again, some of these processes, earthquakes, natural things that have to happen, those tectonic plates, we know about them. We understand how they shift. We can't predict them, but we know that they're going to shift, and we know what causes them. Wildland fires in of itself are not evil. It's a natural process of how our world, there's actually, if I'm not mistaken, I think there are even some seeds that are purposefully harvested or that are planted with fire in mind, that actually that sparks new growth. And so I think there are sometimes that we just misunderstand the natural world that we live in, and we're trying to do things that our natural world it's not natural.
So going back onto, it's hard for us to comprehend, right? And then how in the world can we understand God's role in that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think it comes to what we're talking about, who God is in this time of suffering. So who is the God? How can we understand God?
I'll get to that in a second, but before I do, I wanted to just jump in, go back to this idea of the not comprehending some of these natural orders. I think I do want to make sure that we say I absolutely agree that I think y'all hit the nail on the head there. At the same time, I also want to acknowledge, as someone who comes from Louisiana, and waters and hurricanes are a part of my story and my family's story.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't make the pain any less.
No.
Right? Like I think that's gotta be named. And but that's also a part of who God is in this. And that is, God is the one who suffers with us. God is the one who accompanies us, who walks with us through storms, who is by our side every step of the way in that suffering. That has always been the primary source of comfort for me, that even if in that place of suffering, I have confidence that my God is a God who's in the business of resurrection, who's in the business of making all things new. And so even in those places of deep hurt and deep pain, I know, I think about the story of Ruth, like that's the one that keeps coming to mind, the story of Naomi and Ruth and their loss, and, just tragedy after tragedy befalling them, and being in a place of desperation where they're foreigners in a new land. They've lost their husbands. They've got no means of caring for themselves in this world where unmarried women don't have a structure to provide for themselves. So they are they end up gleaning from the fields. Even in the midst of all of that loss and tragedy, God still redeems their story. And so, God is walking with them every step of the way, ultimately towards that moment of redemption.
And I mentioned free will earlier. I have the free will to cause harm, but I also have the free will to cause healing.
Yeah.
And that's one of the beauties of free will, is that God can use that. We have the ability to respond to God's grace and to do so and be the hands and feet of Christ. We have that. And what happens when we become those instruments of good? What happens when we choose God's will over our will? And I think that's why it's so important. It's also in Romans of the renewing of our minds for the transformation of our lives and our hearts. But when we are focused on God's will, we need that renewal of our minds, because we need to know how are we to respond to the places of suffering.
I think that response comes when we fully understand how God is a God who suffers with us. By saying that, it doesn't mean that God is belittled. I think it just shows that God is willing to fully understand who we are, and in the midst of that, offer that hope of the resurrection. I always wonder why in the world that Jesus had to be crucified on the cross. And my understanding is that God was willing to go through all the suffering to say, when someone comes to God and say, Lord, I'm really having a hard time, God can truly say, I understand. Because I experienced that pain, even though God didn't have to. I experienced how the pain of being betrayed, pain of being belittled, pain of being on the cross and laughed at, pain of losing all my strength, pain of my heart being ripped out. I had all experienced that. And who is a better, because when someone comes to me and talks about the pain of being in a situation of suffering, I don't know if I can really say I understand them until I had that same experience. But God is a God who can say, I fully understand your pain. And not only that, I understand you, that I'm with you, that I can present this hope for you. And when we understand that God, that's when we're prompted to make that decision to respond and be the hands and feet of God. And probably that's the reason why we see empathy as such a strong skill, and we're able to understand that heart that actually prompts us to do something that makes a difference.
Yeah, I don't remember which of the church fathers it was that said this, but one of our early church fathers said, that which cannot be assumed cannot be healed, meaning Christ had to assume the fullness of humanity in order to heal the fullness of humanity.
Exactly.
And I love that quote when we talk about suffering, because that means all that we are, like the putting on of flesh, the walking in our day-to-day life, the experience of sore feet, right? Christ has assumed that experience in order to heal it.
Yep. Yep. The fullest extent.
Yeah.
And then another question to ask is suffering a bad thing? I mean, what I mean by that is sometimes some of my greatest learnings has been through suffering. I had a professor in seminary that intimidated the heck out of me. I'm not the smartest person, and so my first year in seminary, this professor was one of my early professors, and he intimidated me so much so that I refused to take another one of his classes until I had to. And senior year, spring.
I want to know who it is.
Spring of my senior year, he was the only one that was teaching ethics that year. And I had to have Christian ethics for United Methodist pastor. And so I'm sitting here I'm going to go through so much suffering. Not suffering, hurt suffering, but it was going to be tough. But I also, that was one of the classes that I knew and grew the most in. Because it's kind of like working out, for any of those that are gym nerd or gym, I don't know what the name of the people that hang out at the gyms are, but
Gym bros.
Gym bros, is that what it is? Okay.
I think it was suffering for me to just hear that.
But one of the things that I know about muscles is that when you go to work out, you're actually not strengthening your muscle, you're breaking your muscle. You're tearing it. And what happens is when you tear that muscle, it regrows, and where it regrows, it's larger, it's stronger. It's like a broken bone. Where that bone grows back, it's actually a stronger than it was originally. And so that's what happens with muscles, is that they tear, and then they grow back bigger, and they tear, and they grow back bigger, and that's actually how you grow muscle. And sometimes, I think that's what Paul is talking about in this Romans text. Suffering produces endurance. And endurance produces character, and character produces hope. It's that maybe suffering isn't all bad also. We often think of suffering evil. Sometimes suffering is healthy or is positive.
No, well, hold on. I'm going to jump in here and say, I think I hear where you're getting at. I think that there's also a very fine line between that
yes.
and everything happens for a reason.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Right? Like there's a very fine line between I'm going through this suffering so that God could teach me this lesson or God could transform me. But there's a difference between that and saying that no, we live in a space of free will, and we worship a God who does make all things new, who is able to bring life from death. Right.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So actually,
yes.
I was going to say the same thing.
That is, I understand that there is a danger there for sure.
Yeah.
And that's where I was going to say, because he lives. And that's with the song that we sing.
Yeah.
It's not that everything happens or God had gave that suffering for us, but because he lives, I can face that suffering.
Correct.
I can face that tomorrow. And for me, who comes from Korea, where all men has a mandatory service, that's something that we cannot run away from. We have this saying called, if you can't get away from it, get something out of it. And suffering is something that we can't get away from.
Correct.
The world is full of suffering. And I'm not saying God is pushing all these suffering to us, which would be everything happens for a reason. I'm not saying that. Yeah. But once it is in our face, because we know that the God who is suffering with us, at least we can get something out of it, is where...
I think that's more so what I was trying to get to. Thank you, RJ, for helping me get there.
Yeah. Well, and this is where faith comes in too, right? Like holding on to that hope of, we say we live in the hope of the resurrection, and I think that comes in many different forms. And so we live in, we have the faith that God can take this place of suffering, and we hold on to that hope of resurrection, redemption, even while we're in, what the psalmist would call that pit of despair, right? We hold on to the hope of new life.
Because God is victorious.
And that God, sorry.
No.
And that God is with us in that suffering.
Yes.
God doesn't leave us or forsake us. God is with us in the midst of those troubles that we're experiencing. God comforts us.
Yeah. I find comfort in the fact that when I'm in the midst of suffering, I just think about how Christ suffered, how God suffered upon the cross for you and me. He knows our sufferings. He's experienced it.
So with that brings us to our closing of holding on to that God who is victorious, but not yet.
Yeah. The already not yet God. I love this. And I think that this is so important to talk about when we talk about the experience of suffering and the presence of evil in the world, because we have to recognize that, yes, there is evil, there is suffering, there is brokenness, there is sin in our world. However, we in Christ, we know that evil and sin and death and suffering are not going to have the last word. We know that the resurrection of Christ has already defeated them. It has already happened. It's just not yet fully manifest. And so as the church, we're living in this thin space in between, in between the time when God has in Christ defeated the powers of sin and death, but it's not yet complete. You know, the inbreaking of God's kingdom on earth, not yet complete. And so in that thin space in between, in the already not yet, where there is an experience of suffering, this is the age of the church, right? This is the time when we have that call to be the hands and feet of Jesus, to walk alongside one another, and to embody, I think, in a lot of ways, the presence of God in the midst of suffering for people. In other words, show up, be there for your siblings in Christ who are in that time, are in those experiences of suffering. Walk alongside them, be the presence of God, be the hands and the feet of Jesus in the world, knowing that we hold on to that ultimate hope of resurrection, and we hold on to the truth that, evil, suffering, it doesn't have the last word.
And that is where we're going to pause.
Or we're going to leave it.
Yeah, and leave it. That we see and we hope that everyone continues to hold on to that promise of the hope and be the hands and feet of Jesus, weeping with others and rejoicing together. Thank you all for listening to this podcast. Actually, thank you all for joining in this conversation. Thank you all for listening to this podcast, where we hope this will help you in your wrestle with doubt and also finding faith. Please continue to join us for our services. And as Josh had said, if you have any comments, questions, please do not hesitate to put it underneath our comment sections, and hope that we can see you again next week.